There is a persistent assumption that survival during the Cold War belonged to those who could afford concrete, steel, and distance. Deep bunkers, remote locations, and elaborate engineering. It's an assumption reinforced by decades of imagery: blast doors, underground command centers, and fortified compounds built to withstand the unthinkable. Yet the historical record suggests something far less intuitive. Many of those expensive systems were fragile in ways their designers underestimated, dependent on power, maintenance, and perfect conditions that rarely exist during actual crises. At the same time, a quieter line of thinking emerged among civil defense researchers, engineers, and ordinary citizens. It did not rely on complexity or cost. It relied on physics, soil, and time. These individuals discovered that survival in a nuclear age was not necessarily about going deeper or building stronger in the conventional sense. It was about understanding how radiation behaves, how air moves, and how the simplest materials, when used correctly, can outperform engineered systems. What they developed was not widely celebrated. It did not carry the prestige of hardened bunkers or military installations, but in many cases, it worked better. The Cold War forced ordinary people to confront survival as a technical problem, not a distant abstraction. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, nuclear strategy had shifted from isolated weapons to the expectation of large-scale exchange. This change had immediate consequences for civil defense planning. Governments could no longer assume evacuation would be viable, nor that only major cities would be affected. Fallout patterns were unpredictable, and even areas far from direct targets could become hazardous within hours. In the United States, the Office of Civil Defense began promoting fallout shelters, but the gap between official recommendations and practical implementation quickly became apparent. Urban shelters were often overcrowded or inaccessible. Rural populations were left to improvise. In both cases, the question was not whether protection existed, but whether it could be built quickly, cheaply, and effectively by people without specialized equipment. This is where a small but influential group of researchers began to rethink the problem entirely. Among them was Cresson Kearney, a civil defense analyst at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, who would go on to document some of the most practical survival methods ever developed during the Cold War. The realization that Earth could outperform concrete changed how survival was understood. The key insight was deceptively simple. Gamma radiation, the primary danger from nuclear fallout, can be significantly reduced by mass. Not necessarily specialized materials, but sheer density and thickness. Concrete works because it is dense. Steel works for the same reason. But so does compacted earth. Tests conducted during the Cold War demonstrated that a relatively modest thickness of packed soil could reduce radiation exposure by up to 98%. This was not theoretical. It was measured, repeated, and verified under controlled conditions. What made this discovery significant was not just its effectiveness, but its accessibility. Soil is available almost everywhere. It does not require manufacturing, transport, or industrial processing. When shaped correctly, whether as berms, trenches, or covered shelters, it provides protection that rivals or exceeds more expensive alternatives. This reframed survival from a question of resources to a question of knowledge. The most effective shelters were often the simplest to build and maintain. One of the most practical designs to emerge from this period was the expedient shelter. These were not permanent structures. They were designed to be built quickly, often in a matter of hours or days, using materials already at hand: wood, doors, earth, and basic tools. A common form involved digging a trench, reinforcing it with available supports, and covering it with layers of soil. The depth and thickness of the covering were calculated to maximize radiation shielding while maintaining structural integrity. The result was a low-profile shelter that blended into the landscape and required no specialized components. Unlike reinforced bunkers, these shelters had no reliance on electricity, mechanical ventilation, or sealed systems. This absence of complexity was not a limitation. It was an advantage. In a post-detonation environment, power grids would likely be compromised. Mechanical systems would fail or become difficult to repair. Simplicity ensured reliability. This principle would later influence survivalist thinking well beyond the Cold War. Passive airflow systems solved one of the most overlooked problems in confined shelters. Protection from radiation was only part of the equation. Air quality presented a different challenge. Enclosed spaces, especially those designed to be sealed against contamination, could quickly become uninhabitable without ventilation. Cold War engineers addressed this with an approach that avoided dependence on powered systems. One of the most notable solutions was the Kearney air pump, a manually operated ventilation device constructed from simple materials. It could be built using plastic sheeting, wood, and basic tools. Yet it was capable of moving significant volumes of air with minimal effort. More importantly, shelter designs began to incorporate passive airflow principles. By carefully positioning entrances, exits, and air channels, it was possible to create natural circulation driven by temperature differences and pressure gradients. This allowed shelters to remain ventilated, even without continuous human operation. These systems were not perfect, but they were resilient. They acknowledged the reality that in a prolonged emergency, sustainability matters more than peak performance. Many official bunkers were compromised by the very systems meant to sustain them. In contrast, some of the more sophisticated shelters suffered from structural and logistical vulnerabilities that became apparent only under scrutiny. Complex ventilation systems required filters that needed replacement. Power-dependent components introduced single points of failure. Sealed environments risked internal contamination if even minor breaches occurred. There was also the issue of occupancy. Large public shelters often assumed orderly access and distribution, conditions that are, honestly, difficult to guarantee during a crisis. Overcrowding, insufficient supplies, and delayed entry could undermine their intended purpose. This is not to suggest that all bunkers were ineffective. Many were well designed within their parameters, but their success depended on a chain of conditions that could not always be maintained. The simpler earth-covered shelters, by contrast, reduced those dependencies. They were not immune to failure, but they were less likely to fail catastrophically. Fallout patterns revealed that timing and positioning mattered as much as structure. Another overlooked aspect of Cold War survival planning was the behavior of fallout itself. Contrary to popular perception, radiation levels from fallout decreased significantly over time, following a predictable decay curve. The first 48 hours are the most critical. After that, exposure risks decline rapidly, though not entirely. This meant that survival was not solely about enduring a blast, but about managing exposure during a specific window. Shelters did not need to be permanent residences. They needed to provide sufficient protection during the period of highest risk. Earth-covered shelters were particularly well suited to this requirement. They could be constructed quickly, used intensively for a short duration, and then abandoned or repurposed as conditions improved. This temporal dimension of survival is often absent from popular discussions, which tend to focus on long-term habitation rather than immediate resilience. The lessons extended beyond nuclear war into broader survival strategy. As the Cold War progressed, these insights began to influence thinking beyond nuclear scenarios. The principles of using local materials, minimizing system dependencies, and prioritizing adaptability proved relevant to a wide range of emergencies. Natural disasters, infrastructure failures, and even economic disruptions all share a common characteristic. They expose the limits of complex systems. In these contexts, the ability to improvise with available resources becomes a critical advantage. The Cold War engineers who focused on expedient shelters were not just solving a nuclear problem. They were developing a framework for resilience that remains applicable today. Despite its effectiveness, this approach has not maintained the same visibility as more commercialized survival solutions. Modern preparedness culture often emphasizes equipment, technology, and long-term storage. These are not inherently flawed strategies, but they can overshadow simpler methods that require more understanding than purchasing power. There is also a psychological component. Bunkers and high-tech systems provide a sense of security that is immediate and tangible. Earth shelters, by contrast, require effort, planning, and a willingness to engage with less polished solutions. Historical memory plays a role as well. As the Cold War receded, many of these practices were archived, documented, and then largely forgotten outside of specialized circles, yet the underlying principles have not changed. At its core, this history challenges the assumption that survival is primarily a function of resources. It suggests instead that knowledge, adaptability, and an understanding of physical principles are often more decisive. The engineers and civilians who developed these methods were operating under constraints that mirror those of any real crisis: limited time, limited materials, and uncertain conditions. Their solutions were not perfect, but they were grounded in reality. They recognized that in many cases, the most effective response is not to build something stronger in the conventional sense, but to work with the environment as it exists. Earth, airflow, and time are not substitutes for technology. They are foundational elements that, when understood, can reduce dependence on it. The Cold War produced a vast body of knowledge, much of it shaped by urgency and necessity. Some of it became institutionalized. Much of it did not. The expedient shelter is one of those ideas that persist quietly, documented but rarely discussed. Its value lies not only in its technical merits, but in what it represents: a shift away from dependence toward understanding, a recognition that resilience often comes from simplicity, not complexity. In an era where preparedness is frequently framed in terms of acquisition, this perspective offers a counterbalance. It reminds us that the most durable solutions are often those that can be built, maintained, and adapted without external support. That lesson is not confined to the Cold War. It is a recurring theme in the history of survival. If you value this kind of in-depth, overlooked history, the kind that changes how you think rather than just what you know, subscribe to Hidden in History. And if this perspective challenged your assumptions, share it with someone who still believes survival is something you can simply buy.